people, the committees, etc. So you put all this work in to keep this organization going. And how do you know that you have done a good job, right? In my mind, one is the fact that it keeps perpetuating itself, right? That people, that connectedness that has been built up keeps bringing in more volunteers and keeping the organization going. That's a narrow, almost like a sort of necessary condition for the organization to work. But then if we can show that in the different countries, the people who have come to this have had an impact. I mean, I talk about two kinds of impact without getting into quants, just illustrative. So Christoph, who is actually from the African network that we haven't reported on, hopefully that will be the next stage of this work. And one of our colleagues, who is actually physically located in Sweden, Ibrahim. You guys got together and published a piece in the Indonesian newspaper. And then the Indonesian regulators are calling me and said, "You're not done with us yet? Your guys are still writing," right? the policy guy, the government guys. There's one more from your side, people, right? So that means that the policy people actually read it and they were aware of this happening. So to me, that's sort of one indicator. So they wrote the op-ed, and I got some indication from the policy people, from the government people, that they noticed, right? Now, if that was implemented, you had a price formula, right? Some way of calculating price baskets, right? So if that was actually implemented, that I would say is success. Now, how can we document those kinds of activities in a not too expensive way? You know, that would be ideal. My other example is a guy called Rajendra Kumar. And Rajendra came to the conference. Actually, he's been one of our regulars. He had an MIT PhD, and he was in the Indian Administrative Service. He came and he gave a couple of papers. He came twice or thrice. And suddenly I find that he's in charge of all mobile applications for the government of India. He is additional secretary for mobile applications in the Department of Electronics and Information Technology. So I immediately called him and I said, "Get on the board." I appointed him to the board too, right? So to me, that is perhaps an indicator on that other side. And if we can have some metrics, like people who've been here, you know, Pascal and people like that have been in and out of the public, out of the government system. They come back, they go in. How do you systematically count these things? Is there some way of seeing this as a way of influencing or contributing at least? I don't know how, but I think that we'll have to capture those kinds of examples in a systematic way.
Thank you.
Can I just add that I think not only following the people and the publications, but also following the ideas is important. It's not just the people, because the ideas are taken up by other people that may never have been here, but they get the soundbite.
Four very quick things, because I really want to hear Jean-Paul and Scott, who I think have more insight than I do into a lot of these things. First thing is, it really would be worthwhile to include GigaNet as the fourth organization to look at, because I think they would be very open to the examination of the impact and other things. So I think GigaNet would be a really good fourth arm, as it were, of that. Second thing is that I remember, okay, I made a little impromptu contribution at the end of the TPRC 40th. It was almost like a 40th anniversary wake rather than a birthday party. It was kind of a little bit flat. And I said that, you know, we like going to TPRC because it's Washington, D.C., because it's inside the Beltway, because it's American. And when you look at the literature on TPRC, they talk about welcoming national and international papers. They don't mean national and comparative. National, they mean US, right? So it's very, very obviously a different beast in that way. And I think we all... there's a particular use to it being that kind of beast in itself. The third thing, which is about measurement, I think you're quite right that we should do a lot more work on obviously as academics we're interested in citation indices. I suspect the TPRC figures are very much twisted by the economists and their intensity of cross-referencing and the network effects they seem to create amongst each other's careers in terms of their Many of us who are not economists also get involved in that to a certain extent. I'll just quickly mention the schism at TPRC about lawyers. So I know it was only a very tiny point, but the lawyers don't go to TPRC for a specific reason, which is they felt that Benkler was ambushed a few years ago, and that may change again now and come back. Benkler, when he produced the Wealth of Networks book. But it may have come back because they gave Scott such a nice ride with the utilities, the infrastructure book this last year. They really soft-soaped it. So I suspect that they're holding their hands out to the lawyers. These little schisms between the different disciplines are things that Adam Watson-Brown would enjoy in terms of a kind of papacy version of what's going on. And fourth tiny point, Colin didn't mention this, and it's far too subtle. Everyone has got free access to info for the next months. You may not have even noticed it because it's in tiny print. The thing in your packs says free access to info. And by the way, ignore, I haven't said this, I'm the associate editor of Info. Put papers on academia.edu, not SSRN, because that's a much more open way of publishing. But people really should put working papers up there. I don't think there's any excuse anymore for people just hiding their papers and refusing to stick them on the web for at least comment, right? Are we academics or mice? Or are we mice of academics? I don't know. I really think we should, and I thank you for telling everyone that we should, because we should stiffen our sinews.
Is there someone with something burning to say? I mean, just up to you. This gentleman? Okay.
Do I need this or do you hear me?
I'll use this as well.
Yeah. Okay. I'm actually surprised by the very utilitarian approach you take to this kind of conference. I mean, and I wonder whether what you're trying to achieve is possible. How can we assess what ideas floating around the world have as an influence on this world? I mean, it's impossible. It's methodologically not possible to do that. And do we need to do it? I'm not sure. And while thinking that, I was thinking of something that Jean-Paul Simon said years ago. He was still working for France Telecom. And the question was quite similar to this debate. And I asked him, why does someone from France Telecom to a conference like this? And he said, well, if I go back with one or two good ideas, it's been worth the investment, and that's all I need.
That's what Albert Redmond said, having been here for the first time today and yesterday. Really enjoyed it.
Do you want to?
No,
Okay, Scott?
I'll then respond.
Yes, well, first I'd like to really applaud what you've done. As a matter of fact, I guess I have a different view here than Pascal. You know, normally I think that anything that's worth doing is also worth measuring and understanding how effective you are. And usually what I would take as a starting point for that is saying, you know, what is the mission statement or what are the objectives of the organization? You know, almost the same way I'd approach an impact assessment for one of the European institutions. So, I think you're very much on the right track here. I think this is great, and I like the cross comparisons between the organizations. Secondly, I'd like to endorse one thing that Chris, well, I like a lot of what Chris says, but particularly this notion about publication. I think these days, really work, including work that's still in a formative state, belongs in public view. I normally make a point of not publishing things in journals where they won't be posted on the web for no charge, because to me the most important thing is to have my work visible. That's why we in the public policy space do these things. Okay, now having said that, I was going to quickly interject two bits of information that relate to some of the U.S. comparisons as a sort of transatlantic figure here. One of which I think is very much relevant to one of the slides you put up in the lawyer's question. A couple of years ago, I presented a paper at the ITS conference in Budapest that was an assessment or comparison among a number of different regulatory agencies around the world of the mix of lawyers, engineers, and economists. It was, of course, inspired by my U.S. experience. I think everybody knows I'm former U.S. FCC. I was also on the program committee, by the way, of TPRC for many years. Basically through Europe, as you might expect, all of them had reasonable mixes of all three skill sets. And Europe tended to be a bit heavier on economists than some other regions of the world, which I think is absolutely understandable when you consider that our regulatory framework is so heavily motivated by competition economics and competition law. It's not at all surprising that we would need a heavier mix of economists in Europe than in some other parts of the world. With the FCC, even though folks wanted to help me, believe it or not, I had to issue a FOIA request to get the information out of them. I had to issue a request under the Freedom of Information Act. But I did get the data on the mix of lawyers, economists, and engineers at the FCC, which was quite fascinating. There were actually hundreds of engineers, which for me was sort of amusing. I'd worked there for 4 years and I'd never met more than a dozen. But there were large numbers of lawyers, as you might expect. And this is out of the professionals, out of the knowledge workers. To me, the most telling single set of statistics came from the 31 senior managers. I tried to distinguish in each of the breakdowns between knowledge workers overall, middle managers, and senior managers. Out of 31 senior managers, more than half were lawyers. One was an engineer. That has to be Julie Knapp, the head of the Office of Engineering Technology. Not a single economist. And I tell this to most people, and they say, that explains a lot. Yeah. So, but
maybe a bunch of lawyers who just took what the economists said all the time.
well, it seems to me that the economics are particularly helpful in terms of understanding likely consequences of regulatory policy initiatives. And it says to me that they're sort of that they don't have anybody at the rudder. I mean, the lawyers bring a different skill set. I would argue.
They just didn't believe what they said.
Well, I wouldn't, maybe not quite that bad, but in terms of projecting policy impacts, I think that their training doesn't especially well help prepare them for that. One last thought would be on citation frequency. I think the very rich mix of citation interactions that you see at TPRC, and apologies in advance here to the North American attendees, but I think it's partly strength, partly weakness. I think it says that the North American community is much more inbred than here. I continue to be active on a number of U.S. mailing lists. I continue to be in frequent contact with people like chief economists and chief technologists at the FCC. They're much less likely to be aware of important literature coming from outside the United States than we in Europe are to be aware of major papers written inside the United States. So that measure, I think, is a double-edged sword. Okay, and with that...
Thank you. Someone else? Well, with that in mind, I won't even try to conclude this panel. I would just like you to help me clapping this exceptional panel, vision and work, and I mean it. Thank you very much all, and I will give you the phone to you. Just in time for you, Robin.
Yes, and I will be as brief as possible. It says here I will do concluding remarks, and I really do only have a few. I think on the substantive side of what's been going on in the last day and a half, I think the thing that struck me, in contrast to last year and years before, is a really clear juxtaposition, comparison of two aspects of policy, one industrial policy and one market-led policy. And in almost every discussion, it's been on the one hand, on the other hand, on the one hand, on the other hand, regardless of which way around you want to put it. And in that sense, it's been quite fascinating, and that's been true in terms of thinking about the evidence base for understanding the outcomes of that tension, which has always been there in one way or another. But it seems to me now it's getting much more obvious in terms of on the one hand and on the other hand. And whether it's subsidizing broadband or not, or whether it's pricing, we see this in so many of the discussions. We see it in terms of community building and rural development of broadband. We see it in terms of the debate between supply and demand on the other hand, or even revealed demand, however one thinks about that. And I think one way to think about that is whether we're going through a particular cycle. People talk about business cycles. Is this a particular policy cycle where things are really shifting? The ground in Europe around the Commission, but in the member states as well, is really shifting. And we're not sitting looking into crystal balls, but we are providing a basis for assessing what that shift looks like. And it will be taken from our hands, that evidence base, the econometric models, the interpretation of the evidence, the qualitative studies, and they will walk away and they will say, it means this to us. And that will be combined with the business leaders and with the policy bureaucrats. So change will happen. And it seems to me that this conference gives me hope that CPR can go on into the future and continue to make that little bit of difference. So those are my substantive comments. It will never happen without its organizers. So I specifically would like to thank the organizing committee, which is Karen, Natasha, Afra, Jean-Paul, and Leo, and all the people sitting outside. And especially the people whose names I haven't come to know, but they were as helpful as also. And, sorry. Luciano. A latecomer organizer who stepped in and was very helpful as well. Thank you to you. And then the last thing I want to say is we've benefited enormously from our sponsorship from the Internet Society. You are our sole sponsor, I believe, so you deserve our sole thanks, and we are very grateful indeed. And I think now we adjourn and have drinks. So thank you to all of you.